Hello and welcome to Pagabo Live, our initiative designed to promote knowledge in the public sector. My name's Tom, and over the next hour, we'll be talking about public-private partnerships with our panel of industry experts. Jamie, if you could introduce yourself, please.
Yeah, thank you, Tom. Jamie Marsh. I'm a partner within Ryder Levitt Bucknell. I head up the asset and investment advisory business for within our built asset consultancy part of the RLB UK business. My PFI experience started back in 2008, where I've worked continually within the sector since then, working for public and private sector clients, really sort of servicing the industry and dealing with a lot of things that we're going to deal with today.
Thanks, Jamie. Great to have you. Sonia, you now, please.
Thank you. Sonia Macrob, Senior Associate at Ryder Levitt Bucknell. I've got background in finance, local authorities. I spent 20 years working in large and complex organisations, and much of that has been focused on kind of business change, infrastructure programmes and advisory. And I spent about 10 of those on PPPs, working on schools, waste, transports and bits of housing as well.
Excellent. And last but by no means least, James.
Thanks, Tom. Hi, everyone. James Beacon. I'm an associate in the public sector advisory team at Knight Frank. So the two principal areas that we work on PPPs at Knight Frank is firstly on advising authorities on PFI handback, and that's we've advised around 7 authorities on that process over the last couple of years, and then also on advising on regeneration schemes, things around partner selection, and we're doing some work around development corporations as well, which have a strong PPP element, which we will get onto later in the discussion. So yeah, looking forward to discussion.
Excellent. You're very right. We'll be getting onto all of those topics throughout the discussion that we have today. Hopefully, as long as the fire alarm doesn't go off again in the RLB office as it did just as we were rehearsing before. Yeah. So if you do lose Jamie and Sonia for a second, it is a real fire, and please, hopefully, they'll get out in time. Moving on then. So,
a glass of water next to me, Tom. Just you can douse yourself.
So today's event is a Q&A session. So we're going through a bit of a recap of the history of public-private partnerships, an overview of the PFI, and also a look at how any future models may work going forward. We love it if the audience could get involved as well in these sessions, so please feel free to ask as many questions as you'd like. You can use the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Depending on what version of Zoom you've got, it's either right there at the bottom of the screen, or you might have to click more to open it up. But if you put any questions in there, we'll hopefully get round to asking them to the panel later on in the session. We'll also be running our regular poll sessions to gauge everyone's level of interest and confidence in everything that's going on in the PPP and the PFI markets at the moment. So we'll start with our first audience poll, and if you could fire that up now, please, Matt. We are looking at rating your current understanding of public-private partnerships PPP models. So if you could answer that, please, with 1 being no knowledge, 4 being very knowledgeable, and 2 and 3 obviously right in the middle there. So this is an exercise we go through in every Pagabo live session. And what we'll do is also check this again at the end. So hopefully we'll have built some public sector knowledge throughout the session. Matt, if you could close that now, please. So looking at that poll, we're looking at, again, this is where my quick maths gets tested out. We're looking at around 80% of people having a lower level of knowledge of PPP models, which hopefully our panel will help alleviate throughout today's session. So we'll start off then, ideally, with a bit of background. So we'll ask you to start on this, James, but feel free to jump in, Jamie and Sonia, when you see fit. Can you give us a bit of background on public-private partnerships in the UK?
Yep, great. Thanks, Tom. So yeah, we thought it would be useful just to go over a bit of recent history in terms of the context of what we're talking about today. So, and forgive us because we do sometimes use PPPs and PFIs interchangeably in this. Obviously, PFIs is a form of PPP. So PFIs were first initiated in 1992 under the Conservative government. I think in the initial phase of PFI in 1992, there wasn't widespread uptake. They really expanded in 1997 under the Tony Blair government, and the intention, one of the motives behind that was the government didn't want to increase borrowing at that point to invest in a raft of different infrastructure schemes through PFIs. So there's a widespread increase in investment in PFIs during that period, peaking. I think it was sort of peaking in the mid 2000s. And one of the primary motivators at the time was the off balance sheet treatment, which was later revised and to some extent reversed. It's been successful in some areas, controversial in others. There's a handful of controversial examples that have been widely reported in the press. Things like empty schools still being paid for by local authorities, and also in our work advising on PFIs, we do see a real range in how assets are maintained and the condition and the relationships of assets. Then around 2008, in the financial crisis, there was a bit of a dip in terms of investment in PFIs, which led to the introduction of PF2 in 2012, which adapted the model slightly, although there was no sort of continued high level of investment after that introduction of PF2. And then eventually PFI was formally cancelled in 2018, and the government announced that as of 2018 they would no longer be investing in PFI. And since then, and to some extent before that, there's been a range of other PPP models which have been used, particularly in Wales and Scotland and other areas. So Jamie, do you mind just jumping in and giving us an overview of your RABs and your BIMs and the other PPP models that we have seen alongside and after PFI?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, just to give a bit of context to where the take up was, really, I think James is where we need to start off with. Is so there's currently just over 660 PFI projects, and that's not. And again, it's kind of that interaction between the PPP phrasing and PFI. So on top of that, there's around 300 sort of lift models that are kind of in circulation as well. So we're kind of topping up around the sort of thousand projects mark. When we talk about projects, that is per project. Each project may well have multiple schools, buildings, entities within that. I think looking at the figures, we did some analysis. There's approximately around 15 million square meters that are under PFI, and or just under the PFI guys, actually. The expiry curve for those, looking at when they came onto the table, a lot of them run into the 20, 30, 40. There are some later ones that have gone into 50 years. So from that sort of 2000s to 2010 build period, you're then talking about those periods afterwards. So the peak of the PFI handback comes in at around between 2035 and 2037. And we're on a bit of a tidal wave towards that as we speak. Again, 2036, 37, you're looking at about 60 to 70 projects that are due to come back into the public domain. When you look at the extent of that and actually what's required, that's quite intimidating as a sector, you know, just as a sector itself. And we are also looking at how we deal with that as a sector, as surveyors, as advisors. You know, we need to make sure there's enough of us to sort of deal with this thing that's coming through. So there's very much, we are at the forefront of that wave, and we need to be aware of that kind of wave. We talk about PPP in different versions. You know, we've got the PFI, which is quite an inflexible contract, which James and Sonia will talk about a bit later. You're then moving into the LIFCO sort of versions of, and now we're sort of moving into the MIM model, which is the mutual investment model. They've all got different risk shares with them, and also there's different premises around, does the asset revert back to the public sector at the end of the contract? The lifts do differ from the PFIs in that place, to be honest. I don't know if James and Sonia want to pitch into some of those extra info, really.
Add in really that, you know, part of the reason PFI was brought in was because typically public sector procurement wasn't, you know, projects weren't built on time and on budget. And that was one of the main instigators for bringing PFIs in. And I think the NEO did conclude that on balance that's one of the big benefits of PFI, that it does deliver on time and on budget, which it's not often reported about, I think. So it's just worth noting that, I think.
No, excellent point to wrap up that first kind of background and introduction. Obviously, we mentioned PFI quite a bit there in the response. So our second poll is about the expiry of PFI contracts, and it's one for our audience to kind of give their experience and where they're at and their journey with it at the moment. So, how far away is your organisation from a PFI contract expiry? So, we've got a couple that have said they're within 1 year, from 1 to 3 years. 3 to 5 years, 5 years plus, or not applicable if you're not in that situation at the moment. So it'd be interesting to see, based on your timeline you were discussing there, Jamie, what response we get here. So Matt, if you could close that poll now, please. So interesting that for quite a lot of people it's not currently applicable. So that's an interesting takeaway from that. But looking at the responses there, most of those who is applicable for have gone for that 5 years plus, which, as you said, Jamie, that sort of 10 to 12 year curve that you're talking about, and that being the sort of peak of it, does seem to match up with those figures that we've seen there. So
Can I just pitch in there, Tom?
Absolutely, yeah, go on.
I'll sort of finish up with that one, really. That's quite interesting because the sort of the IPA guidance, I was involved with the working group, sort of the guidance. The guidance came out in 2022, was looking at sort of a review of your contracts and where you are, sort of a health check at year 7 before expiry. I think from experience, the sooner the better is very much that sort of that remit. I think 7 years is possibly challenging in some scenarios. So I think the earlier the better you can look at that. So actually the people that have got the non-applicable bit, they may well be outside of the 5 year period, but actually if you're inside the 5 year period, you're kind of on a different trajectory than you are before you hit to the 7 years. Yes. So get ahead of the game, really.
Yeah, looking at a slightly different metric there. So yeah, getting ahead of the game, absolutely the way forward there. So we're going to talk about the resurgence of PPPs now, and we'll go to you first. This one again, James. So what's behind the sort of seeming recent resurgence that we've had in PPPs?
Yes, I think the first thing is it's kind of a increased narrative and noise around it rather than necessarily actual delivery to date. But I think the government has got these tight fiscal rules and huge need for infrastructure and housing investment. And as part of its manifesto and some of the narrative that we've heard from Rachel Reeves and others, is that they are going to encourage investment, private sector investment in infrastructure. I think the UK, comparatively compared to other economies, things like pension funds invest comparatively low levels of money into domestic infrastructure compared to comparable economies. So we've got these infrastructure challenges, we've got these financial challenges, and there's noise around it. And it does seem like the government is going to push on delivery of infrastructure in partnership with the private sector. So there's a few areas to sort of highlight here. So the projects that we are seeing to date. So the Euston Station development, the government has announced that it will be utilising private sector finance to invest the capital in the Euston Station project. We've seen announcements around Thames Tideway Tunnel, Hinkley Power Station, and the Lower Thames scheme. So we have seen these kind of mega projects, a number of which have been inherited and already in place, being pushed forward utilising private sector finance. So firstly, yeah, these mega projects are utilising private sector finance. I think if you look at the institutions, NISTA has been set up, and there's a clear kind of role and mandate there with encouraging private sector investment and private sector partnerships. So NISTA, the National Wealth Fund, has a clear role to play in delivery and encouragement of PPPs with the various funding and delivery strands that it has there. So the institutions, I think, and the adaptations that have been made to those institutions is important. One thing that perhaps has less airtime in the press and in commentary is around development corporations. So the Levelling Up and Regen Acts 2023 introduced a new form of development corporation, locally led urban development corporation. There's also locally led new town development corporations, which effectively allows local authorities or a group of local authorities to come forward with a proposition to establish a development corporation. And these have various powers that can enhance growth and sort of deliver the homes and the infrastructure that we're talking about. Some of these are around funding and finance. They can put in bespoke requests for fiscal measures, which might be around revenue raising powers. and they also have some plan making powers. But fundamentally, they can also utilise the private sector development skills. So the expectation is that a number of these development corporations will be established, and they will have joint ventures as part of the working group. So that will allow private sector expertise and joint venture partnerships to deliver the growth and the housing that we're talking about. So I think development corporations, whilst we haven't seen much in the public, will become a key area, and they're part of the reason behind the resurgence of PPPs. But yeah, I think the main thing is the messaging from government and some of the talk around sort of de-risking private sector investment and wanting each pound of public sector money to crowd in extra private sector capital. So that seems to be the clear direction of travel. But one of the key things is going to be the 10-year infrastructure strategy, which is expected to be published in June 2025, which obviously we're all very excited about.
It's definitely one of the big talking points in the industry at the moment. Sonia, I saw you nodding along there. Anything to add from yourself and Jamie?
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to add, on one hand, from a policy perspective, we're very much seeing that shift towards kind of central coordination and focus on the big infrastructure, all the things that James mentioned. But then on the other hand, we're also seeing that kind of arguably the biggest kind of power shift out of Parliament and back into the regions and local government through the English Devolution White Paper, which was published in December 2024, and through some of the changes that it's proposing. And I think one of the significant components of this is the move away from the kind of piecemeal pots of funding, which were traditionally competed, like levelling up, towards a more integrated regional settlements. Which will be dependent on kind of functional responsibilities, and I think and being able to unlock those based on specific eligibility criteria. And I think that's quite interesting in this space, because it opens the door, I guess, for greater leverage with public-private partnerships, and James is alluding to that through development corporations, which you could see being quite a neat loop into that, created in regions, which would hopefully drive better outcomes. But so yes, I think we're going to be seeing a different type of PPP, not the sort of traditional ones that we're perhaps used to through the models like PFI and LIFT, etc.
I think you read my mind there. The question that I jotted down there was devolution. What role will it play? Before you jumped in there, so I think it's clearly it's something that's a real a really important adjustment that's been made currently, and yeah, interesting to see how that affects.
Yeah, I think there's a twist, obviously, towards the social value side of things as well. I mean, and the sort of retention of equity within the public sector. That sort of, there's going to be a fine edge balance between bang for the buck for the public sector to actually what risk you still retain, sort of thing. So there's always going to be that sort of piece. I mean, I think Rachel Reeves was aiming at a sort of 3-to-1 ratio. So that would kind of hint at a greater kind of public sector retention of equity within projects, which then gives that influence of how those kind of progress. I think we did read recently there was some crowdfunding that was potentially sort of put forward for some equity within one of these schemes type of thing. That could be a whole new type of world that we go into, is actually the end user being involved directly as a stakeholder. I think that could be an interesting evolution to how these things move. But it's definitely around that sort of that risk share power shift that kind of needs to happen to keep that flexible. And I think there will be different versions for different flavors of crisps for different types of infrastructure. Some will work better for others than others, really.
I think you picked up on a point around social value. I think that's going to be important, because they, particularly in the local government paper, they talk about an outcomes framework, which will measure against things like national missions and other national priorities and economic concerns. So you can see how it's trying to kind of tie all that back in again and generate a greater level of value.
Yeah, we'll touch a little bit on those kind of principles that we'd like to see in future projects moving forward in a little while. And that segues quite nicely into that. But we'll go into our next kind of poll question now. It's one again for the audience to have their say on: how do you think the government could accelerate the delivery of PPP schemes? Is it the pipeline of opportunity to investors, so the attractiveness of deals? Is it more of a procurement issue and how that can speed things up and reduce that bid timeline for people? Is it cash and funding initiatives that can help kickstart these, or is it a lack of skills and experience that need investing in the public sector? So one of those four, if you could, that would be great. It's a single choice question, so you've got to really forcing you to think, because it often is a combination of all of those things. But yeah, one answer, please, from all of our audience. Matt, could you close that poll now, please? And a relatively even split there. So we're looking 32% saying that it's the procurement model that is an issue, and we can touch on that a little later, and where procurement can potentially help with that. But then we're looking at around 25, 23, and 20% for pipeline of opportunity for investors investing in skills and cash funding initiatives and incentives, respectively. So looking at that, it's a fairly even split, with procurement models just coming out in front. Interesting results there. Sonia, what's your take on that?
I would have picked the pipeline of opportunity to invest as the first one, because you need the investment there to make it work. Would be my view. But they're all important, as you noted. You need all of them.
It's absolutely a balance, isn't it, of those things, and almost you need that kind of perfect storm of all of those things coming together to make projects progress forward at the speed we'd like them to. So, in terms of principles you'd like to see in future projects, we've kind of alluded to a few of them as we've been going through the session today, and a reminder that you can submit questions to our panel through the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. So if you'd like to get anything to our panel to answer by the end of the session, then we'll be more than happy to share them as we go through. So going back to this question, the principles you'd like to see in future projects. We'll go to you first on this one, Jamie, please.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really important to sort of look at what kind of we're learning from the previous models. I think there's very much there's quite a lot of lessons to be learned within that, and actually, because we're going through this sort of pain process, in want of a better phrase, we are still the leading light, certainly in the timeline globally within this. So I think it's very important to kind of recognise that actually we were early adopters of these models, and actually we've gained and paid the price of those models. So we're getting through, the fact that we've managed to get, countless number of, the social value piece, again, sort of going back to it, is that, these investments don't really ever happen within affluent areas. So there is an actual, for what the criticism that comes through the press and things, actually, there is a I don't think you can actually gauge what that value is, of what the schemes have actually brought through them. We've got the standard of education in a lot of areas that just wasn't there 20 years ago, and there's a huge gain within that. So I think the principle of that sort of improving, the social value piece is there, but it's hidden behind the cost and all those kind of things that we get embroiled in. I think one of the big ones for me is that quality piece of actually quality design, how you check that going through the process. That's very much, we're sort of seeing that in the MIM model now. That's kind of, I think that's probably step one of several steps in how that checking process is going through, and actually how you aren't just dependent on that design and build value engineer piece. You are actually checking, so you are building longevity into your projects as well, so that the maintenance need that we know is a challenge within the public sector. We've got the 49 billion backlog maintenance that's been put out. I would probably suggest it's probably a lot more than that, but there is a challenge there that needs resolving, and we need to be proactive about how we do that, rather than being reactive as we are currently, and we have been for the last 50 years of the country. We are in the place where we are now, where these models are essential to us.
I think, Jamie, it's interesting what you're saying about the kind of outcomes and the you reference education there. I think when you're looking at PFI, I think value for money assessments on a sector by sector basis. So looking at the health projects, looking at the education projects, rather than looking at it in the whole, would be really useful if a similar scheme was rolled out. I think it seems, as we discussed, it's going to be PPPs are going to be for these big mega projects in the short term. I think it'd be interesting to see some sort of strategy around the regulation and governance and audit of these PPPs going forward. So I know there's inherent kind of questions around governance and conflicts that may arise where there's a public sector equity stake in the vehicle. So if the expansion continues, I think some sort of standalone strategy around governance and regulation of PPPs would be a positive move.
I think that's a fair point, James, actually, and I think there's some good examples where there has been improved accountability and levels of transparency. I think in the MIM schemes are a good example of that, where you've got and actually LIFT schemes where there's public sector directors on boards. But I think you could take that a step further with I think there's open book accounting actually on the MIM schemes, but you could take that step forward by a bit like you see in alliance type contracts, where those are core principles where you have that kind of open book accounting, that type of ability to check through things, and it ties back into the flexibility we talked about actually yesterday, I think, James, where you need to make changes to contracts. Even if you've got long-term contracts for 20 years, you don't know what your service provision is going to look like in 15, 20 years. We know how much COVID changed that. So it only takes something like that to do the same again. So actually you need to be able to flex some of these contracts, I think, don't you?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think some level of automation as well. So perhaps I know a lot of the PFI issues around the contracts quite dated because they're from the late 90s and early 90s, but contracts stored in a shared place where everyone has the same access, or automation of the payment mechanism, or monthly reporting or deduction. So I think there's a lot, if similar to style to PFIs are done in the future, a lot of enhancements that could be made through automating processes.
Yeah, James. Sorry, Sonia, go on.
As I say, back to what we were talking about on the poll, I think the model's got to stack up commercially to attract investors as well. They're looking for steady returns to match their risk profile, which raises another question around the kind of levels of risk, and things like deal size are important so that they can become efficient, recognizing that often these deals are more expensive because it's more expensive to borrow than it is from, say, the Public Works Loans Board, but there shouldn't be super profits there as well. So, we need to think about that kind of sharing of profits and trying to make sure that it's fair, but not unreasonable.
Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to touch back on a point James made around the PPPs, and now they're sort of pivoted towards more of these sort of mega projects. Were they designed for this in the first place? So are they fit? Is it fit for purpose in that sense? And what problems beyond the ones you mentioned already do you sort of foresee with that going forward?
I'll pass over to Jamie for the first part of that question, Tom, if you don't mind.
Absolutely, Jamie, go on.
Yeah, I mean, I think the principle of PPP, I think if we put it down the PFI route, then I think that you will come up with the challenges that are currently here. I think that flexibility piece is so important, and I think actually the lead in and lead out of these projects is actually as important. Almost like a soft landing kind of approach, which actually we talk very much when we're in the sector about expiry, that sort of cliff edge of someone throws the keys back at you and you've got your building back type of thing. That kind of leading and lead out process actually needs maturing, and I think actually that's something that could be built into a new model of actually how that interacts. So you haven't got that sort of cliff edge between it's private sector one day and it's public sector the next day. There is that interaction piece, because you are looking at things around even TUPE things. That's quite a complex and equally challenges of how you manage these projects. We can see with this horizon that's certainly coming up is that actually the retention of staff from the private sector side to manage these projects. If you're a general manager or a director and your project is coming to an end in 2 years' time, you're going to be looking for the next part of your career, which could actually leave the project, sort of in a bit of a way, and that can happen from both sides. So I think there needs to be a mechanism where there is that sort of softer in and out with regards to how that interaction happens between the two parties, and that's kind of missing in these models at the moment. I mean, even in the LIFT models, there is that sort of, you've got an option to to maybe purchase at the end of that, but then you've got an option not to as well. So it's kind of, yeah, I think that lift model, MIM model piece is that evolution from PFI, which introduces some flexibility, but then there's probably 4 more steps that are required to kind of get to a multiple versions of models that suit what you're actually going for. Is it a super project, or is it a I'm not saying this wouldn't be a super project, but sort of, if you're investing into 20,000 social housing, a scheme that's got that sort of level in, that's potentially touches more end users than actually the super project. But actually, we need those super projects to build, and also, HS2, that type of version of super project is desperately needed within the UK because of the infrastructure's creaking, to say that there's, to be kind to it. So.
I was just going to add, one of the models that seems to be rising in prominence is the Regional Infrastructure Investment Partnership, which is, I think it's an Australian model from Victoria, where they develop a core piece of infrastructure and create that anchor asset alongside a commercial redevelopment or development for wider regeneration. And then these IIPs work with the regions, and you could see how strategically that might be quite effective, tying into what we were talking about with the changes in local government and devolution, and effectively that almost being the kickstarter for development, economic development in an area, whilst there's wider pieces of regeneration that go on, and as part of that, things like operations aren't outsourced, and investors are obliged to invest in hiring and training local workers during the construction period. So you can see how that would all tie into kind of the resurgence and piece that James was referencing back.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for your input, guys, so far. A reminder that the Q&A will be coming up ever so shortly, so please feel free to drop any questions that you have into our Q&A box. But to wrap up, we'll have a couple of final polls. So for our audience, do you think there's a future for PPPs in getting Britain building? So what, yes, no, undecided, or other? So if you do any other opinion on it, please drop that into the question and answer box as well, because that may be a good prompt on the conversation here. So do you feel there is a future for PPPs in getting Britain building? Yes, no, undecided, or other? Please specify in the Q&A. Matt, could you close that poll now, please? So interestingly there, we've got 64% of people saying yes, only 9% of people saying no, but a reasonable percentage, around a quarter of people saying that they're undecided on whether there is a future in PPPs and getting Britain building. Panel, anything there jump out to you as a bit of a surprise?
I think I'm surprised that people do believe it's important. I suppose I expect it to more to be balanced the other way, and for the perception to be quite negative.
Yeah, it's taking me aback a little bit, actually, that one. So well,
just given the kind of press around PFI.
Yes, PFI doesn't have particularly good PR, as we've noticed over time. So final audience poll of the, well, penultimate, we've got a sneaky one for you right at the end, but final audience poll for today. How would you now rate your understanding of public-private partnership models? So we had plenty of people down at the 1 and 2 end earlier. So if you'd answer now, 1 being no knowledge. Hopefully, panel, we don't still see people down at 1, or else you do your job properly. And hopefully we'll see more up to that 3 and 4 side, which is being very knowledgeable. So just a couple more seconds for people to get their votes in. And Matt, could you close that poll now, please? Congratulations, panel, you've done your job. So that's that's nearly 2/3 of people now saying that they are knowledgeable or very knowledgeable about PPPs. So I'm sorry to the 2 people that say that they still have no knowledge. Hopefully you've gained something from the session, if not knowledge about PPPs. We'll now move on then to our audience Q&A. Great to see some positive results there in terms of building public sector knowledge. But a couple of questions from me just to kick us off. Jamie, you sort of touched on this a little bit earlier, but we're wondering if you had any advice for those contracting authorities that are approaching the end of their PFI contracts. I know we sort of alluded to a little bit earlier in that getting started, even if you are way beyond that 5-year timescale. But yeah, any advice from you? And also, James and Sonia, feel free to jump in on this one as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's and we're seeing this in the market actually. Is that we've had conversation recently with projects that are within 18 months and that then they haven't really started the project. They haven't. It's going to be challenging to sort of hit those bumpers.
Yeah.
But I think if you haven't started, then tomorrow is the time to start. To be honest, and think about that because there are. If you just think about things around sort of even if there's a final survey required within the contract, if you've got an acute hospital might take you 12 months to actually do a full survey on it. So, and then you've got to discuss, and that's just the survey piece. Actually around particularly around the sort of the base data and actually exchange of data. We talk about the transparency of data. There will be a data requirement from the public sector, just to run your facility. You'll have statutory and mandatory things there that keep you out of jail. It's one of those thoughts, but that does focus people's minds a little bit when you start talking about that statutory requirement and responsibility to keep your whatever you're dealing with functionable and usable. I think the worst thing that we could probably experience is that the rack style headlines of schools are being shut, children aren't able to go to school, people aren't being able to be treated at hospitals because they've had to shut a facility. That impact would be huge within that. So if you haven't started, start right away. And be more than happy to talk to anybody that is in that predicament, as with James and with Sonia. So it's reach out as soon as possible, and we are very much experienced in directing people in those predicaments because we're dealing with those on a daily basis as we do. So
I think
if you're above that sort of 5-year period, then still think about it tomorrow. But actually, you've got a better timeline to deal with things.
I think one of the things that gets overlooked sometimes is there's sometimes an assumption that the asset automatically reverts back to the public sector body without a payment at the end of the term, whereas for a lot of the early ones, and I think 5 of the ones we've done there, the authority has the option to make a reversionary payment at expiry, and sometimes when you speak to people, they don't necessarily know that at the start of the discussion. So I think looking in detail at the project agreement and any options that the authority has over acquiring the asset, and also detailed reviews of the leases, so the head lease and the sublease, I think is really important because they're central parts of the project document that sometimes get overlooked. And also an area that could help with looking at whether it's a non-reversionary contract, i.e. it doesn't automatically revert at expiry, is looking at the financial close model. So sometimes they will have a payment at the end modelled for what the project co is expecting, or sorry, a proxy for what the project co was expecting to be paid at the conclusion of the contract. So I think that's really important to get to grips with early.
Excellent. Thank you, James, and Jamie, for that advice. So a question that is coming that we're going to reframe ever so slightly. You all obviously work across a number of, and have worked across a number of PPP projects over your time. What are some of the common attributes that that a good project has? So what are the kind of attributes that you see in good projects that are consistent throughout? Sonia, we'll go to you on this one first.
So in terms of when I was bidding or working public side advising, one of the schemes that I worked on effectively saved the council £650 million over the course of the project. So it's a waste project. So that's significant amount of money, because obviously rather than sending waste to landfill, it was going elsewhere to be burnt. But so I think that's a really good example, because it saved a huge amount of money to local taxpayers.
Excellent. Jamie and James, any sort of good common attributes that you see in projects that you've worked on that have gone well?
James, if you want to jump in first, I'll jump in afterwards.
Yeah, I think the day-to-day contract management is obviously very important. I think you get a sense of walking around the sites pretty early whether the relationship's good and whether the project's going well. So I think just the fundamentals that you hear a lot, really. So availability of information, day-to-day contract management, and then the relationship. So nothing too novel to add there.
Yeah, I think you've nailed that really with that. Yeah, this is a partnership. That's the bit that gets lost sometimes when things start to go awry. And we are in the huge kind of operational phase of things, and that those relationships and understanding your contracts is quite important to how you continue that. We do see quite a lot of staff churn from both sides. That I think where you see contracts that are you would call them sort of operationally kind of exceptional is where you've got long-term commitments from staff from the both sides, and you can get that relationship going and actually understand that I think a lot of it is understanding that these contracts aren't perfect from either side, and actually having that view and actually that understanding and actually how to get something that you have different commercial drivers from a public sector to an SPV to a FM contractor. They have different commercial drivers. Actually being in a room, understanding what those are and actually being open about what those are and coming up with pragmatic ways of actually dealing with the contract, because sometimes the contracts, there's ambiguities, they just need talking through, and actually those ambiguities do sometimes sort of lead to a parting of the ways of opinions, whereas actually that discussion earlier on, the maintaining of that relationship actually allows you to have those conversations. Once it's gone to the lawyers, it's kind of too late to sort of bring it back. So a lot of those what we would call good in again, that's probably not the right phrase, but those ones that are working well,
yeah,
you do look at behind those relationships are in place, and there is that kind of if it isn't quite working for one party, they will go to the other party and talk to them about it, because equally the next week it could be the other party going back to the other party asking for those things. So it's very much the way the contracts are kind of written, but equally understanding those contracts from both sides. If you've got that level of understanding, and I think it's the continued sort of interaction as well. It's not something you can put on the shelf for 10 years and then come back to it type of thing. There has to be that agreement and that relationship continuing throughout the fruition of these things. And again, we are only at the start of this bow wave of things, so it's very important that those relationships, even if they aren't good at the moment within a particular contract, if you've got time to get them good type of thing, and have those falling outs, have those discussions, get in a room and get it into a good place, because that expiry piece and handover piece will have to happen, because the clock is ticking on those projects.
It certainly is. We'll just briefly touch on procurement now. Actually, it was one of the four kind of options that we had earlier with 36%. It was the seen as the most important element of getting a project up and running. We'd be interested to see your views, panel, on how procurement can potentially oil the wheels in these partnerships, and how it can be done better potentially to make sure that these projects do get going. Feel free, anyone, to jump in there with if you have particularly strong thoughts on it.
So I don't have experience of the new procurement regulations, but under the old regulations, I know joint venture partner procurement was very long and convoluted, and also at times unattractive to the private sector. So I think there's one example where the requirements for the development had changed halfway through, and one of the developers pulled out and then was talking about refusing to bid for future work. So I think they found that process quite long and complex and time consuming. Not that it doesn't need to happen, but I think there were certainly frustrations from the private sector side under the old procurement regulations. But I guess we're waiting and seeing how the new regulations are implemented and how that improves efficiencies and outcomes.
Yeah, certainly the managed phase of the new regulations will adds a little bit more of a complexity into that. So we've had a comment come in from a Vincent Hunt, who has said that local partnerships are an excellent source of pre-procurement advice for PPPs and some reasonably priced consultancy. Also, not a question, but an observation, and one that's got our panel chuckling today. So we're going to look at, just to kind of wrap up our conversation here, We're going to ask each of our panel for if we could give one bit of golden advice that you'd like people to take away from today's session. What would that be? And I'm going to go down my screen. So unfortunately, Sonia, you are last. So hopefully no one takes everything you're going to say before we get there.
I'm not going to look at Sonia's notes. So
we'll go to James first. How can you? What would you like your key takeaway from today's session to be?
I'll probably dip back into something I said before. So if you have a PFI expiry, read the leases, get a good summary of the leases prepared, and also establish early on if it's a non-reversionary contract, and think about whether the authority wants to make the payment and how the asset will be used post expiry.
Excellent. Jamie, on to you, please.
Yeah, I think echoing James's thing is around know your contract, know what your obligations are under that contract, and if you haven't done it already, do it as soon as possible, so that you've got the longest timeline possible to get yourself into this world, because it can be a prolonged timeline if not addressed correctly.
As you said earlier, the best time to start is tomorrow, right?
Yeah,
if you haven't already. Today, if you haven't already. Straight after this webinar, get in touch with Jamie. Sonia, thoughts from you, please.
So I would go with relationships and know who they are and manage them and make sure you're working together, because ultimately if you go down the route, if you can't agree, you're going to have to try and negotiate at some point. So it's much better if you've got some relationships established in the first place to start those discussions, and don't leave it too late.
Brilliant. There you go. Consistent theme. Don't leave it too late. Times to start is right now. Excellent. So we're just going to wrap up with a final sort of supplementary poll for our audience, so that the Pagabo Live team can help you out with tailored content going forward. So one for our audience: are you interested in exploring procurement options for your estate as part of the PFI handback or expiry process? Are you interested in exploring procurement options for your estate as part of your PFI handback or expiry process? So yes, no, or maybe in the future. Another few seconds on that, please, Matt. Okay, I can close that poll now. Brilliant. Good news. Well, that one is now wrapped up. So we'll move over to our kind of closing remarks. So that is all we've got time for today, unfortunately, but thank you very much for tuning in. We've had a really decent sized audience attending today's session, as we have for all of our Pagabo Live sessions. So thank you all for your continued support of the Pagabo Live project. If it's your first time joining us today, thank you very much. You are now officially part of the Pagabo Live community, so you'll automatically receive a link for all of our upcoming sessions that we have. The next online one will be in June. There is also a newsletter coming out, and there is one that comes out after every Pagabo Live session. It'll include a recording of the webinar in video and podcast form. You can even catch us on Spotify if that's your thing. And it'll also include further insights from the Pagabo Live team. Pagabo Live is also CPD accredited, so you'll be able to claim a CPD credit from attending today's session. You'll receive an email from the Pagabo team in the coming days of just how you can do that. Now, next up for us is we're taking Pagabo Live on the road. It's our annual appearance at UK Reef, where we will have our own pavilion for 2025, something very exciting and keeping the team at this end very, very busy, as I'm sure you can imagine. We've got some great content plans there for the 4 days of the event, so make sure if you are in Leeds and attending the event, you pop down to Pavilion Square in the Royal Armouries for your monthly Pagabo Live fix. It will be in person this time, and also there's some really good coffee in the tent, so one to bear in mind for your UK Reef planning. Anyway, thank you very much again to everybody for your attendance today. Thank you to James, Jamie and Sonia for your support on the panel, and we really hope you had a great time, and we'll see you again very soon. Thank you.